Hello and welcome to Seed Stage. My name's Christopher Goodfellow and I'm the program manager of The Pitch. I'm here today to talk to Gaby from Talk Twenties, who was a pitch finalist a few years ago and won the People's Choice Award. So amazing business helping people find their way in their 20s. And we had a really interesting conversation about Gaby's own journey as a founder. So she's been running the startup for about 5 years now. And she talked about the evolution of that and how she sees the business and what they try to achieve. Part of that is also looking at investment. So they did consider seed investment, get quite close to raising, but didn't end up going through with it. And I think it's really interesting to give that perspective and say, like, is an investment round right for you? And how can you kind of sense check the best way to fund and grow your startup and kind of achieve your goals? So I really appreciated the honesty there. And then finally, Gaby's built some huge channels on social media and a podcast as well, all around this new idea of edutainment. So that's where I had to practice a few times before doing this intro, but I'm sure you know what I'm talking about. And it's great to hear her experience as somebody that's been doing it for a long time and is really being able to capitalize on that trend in both podcasts and social media. So hope you enjoy the episode and thanks for joining us. Thanks for joining us, Gaby. It'd be lovely if you could start by just telling us why you initially launched Talk Twenties and what your vision was at that point.
Yeah, so I launched Talk Twenties back in January 2020, hopefully wanting to launch an events company that would be like the grad fair or the freshers fair of graduating from university, basically, and would help young people with adult life, because there's just nothing, school and university just doesn't set us up for actual success in adult life. There's been so many times when I've thought, how do I do this? How do I manage my finances? Or how do I navigate, romantic relationships? And there's just never been, it's not something that we've actually genuinely been taught in school. We learn all the academic stuff. So I came up with this concept that I really wanted to launch an event. But as we all know, very late into January 2020, we started getting news about this thing called coronavirus, which meant that events were pretty much off the cards for a couple of years. Which then, at the time, you were doing a lifestyle blog. And so I was talking a lot about what it felt like to be in my 20s. And then that was when I wanted to launch this events company alongside it. So instead, I launched a podcast that basically I thought would be maybe 10 episodes and would just entice people to eventually come to the event when lockdown opened up and we could do events. And the podcast just really took off. And I've been doing it now for 4.5 years. We've had guests from all over, like the UK, all different backgrounds, experts, celebrities, you name it. We've been named for podcast awards. We won People's Choice at the Pitch. And it's really grown from there. And we did end up doing 20s Fest back in October 2023. So a good 3 years after the initial idea had kept there. But we're mainly a digital business where we create content that is either short form or long form that helps young people kind of with this kind of step out into adult life, whether that's podcast format or just videos or short form videos as well.
Amazing. And give us a sort of juxtaposition between what it was like in those first 10 episodes in terms of like professionalism and reach and what it's like 4.5 years later. Because I know you've talked before about sort of the importance of sort of incremental growth, testing, iterating, and so on. But I'd love to just compare those two periods.
I used to send my guests a postcard when their episode had hit 100 listens on like a podcast episode, and sometimes it would be like a couple of months after the episode had come out that it had hit like 100 downloads. Now I would have to send that postcard like basically when I woke up that day, the day that it comes out, obviously, because obviously it's a lot different now, and it has grown over 4.5 years. But it hasn't grown like, it's not this crazy great big curve. We've had a few viral moments on social media that have definitely impacted like the growth of the business. But ultimately, it's been pretty steady and consistent for 4.5 years, which is amazing because, not many businesses can necessarily say that. But ours has literally just been like consistent, steady growth. I think that's true of most digital businesses, although with, virality and stuff like that, that can change overnight. But we've just kept really consistent over time. And then now we're in a place where we have kind of 20, 30,000 listeners every month. So yeah, it's very different to that, trying to get to that, 100 listens postcard that we had back in the day.
It's interesting to hear how you sort of grew over time and the consistency you needed there. But I just wondered if there are any moments where you'd pick out where you're like, oh, this is a bit of a shift change in terms of the way we produce it, or something that kind of unlocked a bit of growth.
Yeah, well, initially I started the podcast and it was over Zoom. It was, during the pandemic, and it was that Zoom boom, whatever we had, whereas, everything was done remotely. But we were very early to adopt to a studio setting. I don't know what convinced me that that would be the right way to go. But I kind of did, I guess, bet on that quite early on. And yeah, so our production value of the podcast is very high. So it's expensive to produce, which obviously means it has that little bit more of like a barrier to entry, I guess, than podcasts. Anyone can really start a podcast and start it, like I said, on Riverside or Zoom or one of those kind of things. But it's that slightly more of like a financial commitment to then obviously build a studio, build a set, all of that equipment that you need in order to do that. And we did invest in that early on, which has helped probably attract better guests because they're excited by the opportunity of doing podcasts. And we've took many big creators or experts podcast virginity, which we love to say, because they are like, this is so exciting to be going to a studio for the first time and experiencing it. So we kind of pride ourselves on making it a really enjoyable experience for our guests, because it makes for a better podcast, it makes for a better listen, it makes for better content that we're then putting out into the world. So I think the big shift for us that probably means that we're still going as a podcast, because I'm not sure we would be if we were still doing it via Zoom, is that kind of we meet our guests in person, we spend the day with them, we really get to know them, so that the podcast has more of an, it's better for our listeners to listen to then. We get more deeper into it. So yeah.
It's a really thoughtful shift, because I think now it's kind of more the standard that people do them in person, and that there's video, everyone's doing video as well as podcasts now, but you obviously were ahead of that by a couple of years, so you got that advantage. Talk about the day you spend with them. Like, are there any tips there in terms of like content curation and kind of how you get to know your guests and therefore sort of draw out more value out of the interviews?
Yes, so we have a whole process that we take every single one of our guests through, and obviously at any one time we're always at a different stage with multiple different guests. So for example, an episode went out like yesterday, that will be the relationship we'll have the guests is completely different to the ones that we're about to get on in a couple of months' time. So initially we'll have people who either pitch in or we will pitch out to, or their management will get in touch with us, and we will initially set up a briefing call with that guest to find out a little bit more about the topic that they want to cover, and to build that kind of relationship. Like, we do not want to be a surface level podcast. We want to be scratching beneath the surface. We want to be telling, get our guests to be vulnerable and feel comfortable in doing so. And also there is an element of like strategy to podcasting as well, in terms of, making sure that we get the best out of our guests. We don't want boring episodes. And when you're working with guests all the time, every guest comes with a different experience. Some will be a podcast, pro. They'll have done many episodes. And for some, it will be their very first time. And you kind of have to make sure that you take people through that process so they really know what is going on. We then cover our transport for the guests. We don't want to put any barriers in place for them to want to come. And our studio is in Liverpool. We're not London. We have no issues getting people to travel from all over the UK to our studio to record. In the beginning, that was tough because we were outside of the UK. But now I think we've put enough of a stamp on the map to basically say, like, come to Liverpool, we'll look after you for the day. We always go for a coffee, or guests come to our office, we'll give them coffee and we'll let them settle down and chill beforehand. And prior to when they've come as well, like we've sent them over like a detailed brief, which gives them an itinerary for the day, their train times, what they're doing when they're arriving, when we'll actually be in the studio, and then a breakdown of the kind of topics that we'll talk about in the interview, because we all want them to have some element of like prep. We don't want them to go in really blind. We want them to know the flow of what they're going to be, how they're going to be interviewed, and it just makes the whole day so much easier. So when they get to us in the studio, obviously we give them some time, some headspace to kind of chill. Some are nervous, some don't mind at all. Then we'll head into the studio. We'll record all of our podcast. We'll do some social clips as well, usually behind the scenes. etc., take photos. And then we'll usually take our guests, we're very lucky. Our offices are in a very picturesque part of Liverpool on the Albert Dock, very historic, very loads of tourists want to come there. So guests who've travelled and don't know Liverpool as well want to kind of go and experience that. So we class ourselves as the best tour guides in Liverpool now. So we really do make friends with our guests. I think obviously we're Talk Twenties, so it's all about being in this young generation. And a lot of them, although they might be an expert or they might be talking about one specific area, they'll open up to us about so many different areas of their life that maybe aren't, going too well, or, we can always find somewhere to find common ground. So, we usually take them for dinner or for a bite to eat, and then they head back. And then from that point onwards, we keep in touch. These essentially most of them become friends of ours, and we will then obviously share lots of content with them so that when the day comes that the episode comes out, they're much more likely to post about it, they're much more likely to share about it, and they're much more likely to say to their management, I had a brilliant day in Liverpool, let's do that again. That makes it a really enjoyable experience for us, but also for the guests as well. So I couldn't imagine doing it any other way now. That just feels normal to us.
Amazing. And it's interesting that sort of the podcast thing came about almost sort of haphazardly, and then you've really seen that opportunity, grasped it. When you look across your other channels, like what are the other channels that are sort of most important to Talk Twenties at the moment?
YouTube is really changing the game for us right now. I think the way that this generation consumes content, obviously kind of gone are the days where it's, they're watching terrestrial TV, BBC, ITV, everything is streamed. They're watching it on, different streaming channels or boxes or stuff like that. And nothing is ever really, some people watch live, but, a lot of the time they're picking and choosing the content that they're watching. And quite often that might be, shows that feel like TV shows, but are on YouTube. That is really where the content is going. So our biggest thing is to really become like a channel that you can watch that speaks to 20 somethings. So much, as much as thought that goes into a TV channel like BBC and ITV and all of those kind of things, we feel like YouTube is just really making a huge, not that it ever went away, but a really huge comeback in that space. So for us, whilst podcasting is great and we use all the traditional podcast channels, we are launching other projects that really tap into that YouTube audience. And obviously having a video podcast, it also works really well on YouTube as well. So that's probably our other core channel that we have.
Yeah, and I think is it the guest series that you did a sort of a slightly higher end production? Is that the kind of thing you're thinking of?
Yeah, exactly. Like shows that kind of feel relatable to young people. And that is a really great example because that showcased our audience as well. So we got members, we had 1,000 young people sign up to be on our cast network. And from that, we selected 10 that we put into kind of a gamified kind of show where it was all about guessing, can you guess how old someone is? And, our hosts were absolutely brilliant. And so, yeah, we want to try and create content that is essentially edutainment. So it has that educational spin on things. It has that relatability. It is true of culture and what's going on in the world, but ultimately feels fun to watch. Like we want to be the furthest thing from what feels like going back to school. So yeah.
I love that. And I love that you're programming at such a high level, right? Looking at 1,000 applications, the quality of the filming, we'll include it in a link below, is really high as well. What about the short form social side? So we've obviously worked with you as an influencer before, and your TikTok over the years has grown and grown and grown. And obviously you've got the podcast clips, but you're also doing a lot of sort of vox pop in the street type stuff as well. How's that evolved for you, and how does that sort of plug into your wider mission?
Yeah, I think the street style stuff has been really nice because it's that way that we get that kind of connection with the real world as well. Like obviously a lot of people that come onto our podcast have some kind of platform, are well known, whereas when we're interviewing people on the street, that is genuinely people's I guess like opinions on various different things. And so that's been a really fun experience. And, I think with the podcast, like obviously that's been the most consistent, but we worked on so many different other other things like the Vox Pops, like the new guest content, that allow this whole kind of channel feel where it's like this is the platform where you can go to figure your shit out in your 20s, or not feel so alone. You know, there's other people going through it too. So that obviously can come across so many mediums. Our most successful is the podcast, but there are other projects that we're constantly working on. And we have some new ones in the pipeline as well that we've actually started working on this week. Which means that, you know, not a day goes by where it's boring. And it's really exciting, and it gives us different ways and scopes to work with brands. Not every, you know, most of our income comes through brand partnerships. Not every brand wants to sponsor a podcast. It works for some, it doesn't work for others. But this is a great way that we can work on other partnerships, with, you know, various other partners. So
that's it. And you've sort of created an ecosystem now, right? So it's all presumably feeding each other. That you know, TikTok is a great discovery tool that then they might lead them on to watch something longer form.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, everything just taps in and kind of connects all around. You know, we've got the website, the YouTube, the TikTok, the Instagram, the LinkedIn, like everything just connects. And we try to make sure that we put out one podcast a week minimum. And then the rest of the other content that we work on, Vox Pops, or these new series is in addition to that. That's the one thing that we keep consistent. And then, yes, these other things, as they kind of grow, then we try and bring those in more consistently as well.
Yeah, and I think like a lot of creators now are, you know, learning how to go across several platforms and not being dependent on one, because from a commercial perspective, that's not great, but also realizing that, yeah, the audience does want to go on YouTube and get really high quality long form content too. How is your, as you kind of changed the delivery mechanism, how has the vision evolved over the last 5 years? Like, are you still, do you think it's changed? Like, how have you been able to work on that at the same time?
Yeah, well, I didn't really, when I started the business, like I wanted to create an events business, and of course we did do that with 20s Fest, and it was incredibly successful, but events are very hard to continue to maintain without a big team. We're a really small team. And so the energy that we put into 20s Fest, if we put that into the content that we produce, we could produce so much more and reach so many more. So it's not something that we wouldn't obviously ever do again, but it's not something that we're focusing on now, because naturally we found ourselves in a situation where actually this that we tried, which was our backup, is the most effective way of reaching our audience and reaching young people across the UK right now. So I think in that aspect, obviously my initial plan for launching the business has changed. And then I think every person that probably starts out with a business, especially your first business, you kind of expect it to be, well, you hope that it will become the biggest, you know, multi-million pound business that you've ever seen. I think obviously most people wish that deep down. And I think I've come to a point now where I love being a really small team. I think there's a lot of pressure to kind of keep growing that. And the only way that you can see growth is if you're hiring more people, if you're, you know, doing so many more things. But I've come to a point where I'm like, I love this business where it is, and it will continue, because it has just grown so consistently. It will continue to do that, but I'm not putting loads of pressure on it to be a multi-million pound business, because effectively this business is really successful as it is. And I think as entrepreneurs, we always want more and more and more and more. And I think I've come to a point where I'm like, I'm so happy with where it is right now that actually if it were consistently to stay like this, that would be great. And I've just spent obviously every waking moment for the last 4.5 years thinking about this business. And it's nice to know that like it's got to a point now where I don't have to think about it so much. Everything that we've worked on kind of does run itself. It feels a lot easier to run now than it did in the beginning, when there were so many different, like, could it be this? Could it be this? There were so many more questions. Now it kind of feels like basically like a well-oiled machine, but not a machine that's going to go take us to the moon. It's going to be a machine that, you know, can drive us down the road very nicely, you know?
Yeah, and I think there's you know, a lot of founders do go through obviously an evolution, but there is a kind of thing around, and there's some ego wrapped up in there too, right? Around kind of employee numbers, particularly you mentioned, but then also funding round, that it can sort of trap you into sort of continually being like, oh, that's the goal, I've got to get to that, I've got to get to that.
Yeah, I've definitely been like that in the past, for sure.
Yeah, and do you think there was a moment, like a penny drop moment, where you were like, oh, actually, like what I've done is amazing, and it doesn't need to be this thing?
Yeah, and I think that's genuinely happened. It sounds ridiculous, but in my personal life, I recently got married and I had took some time away from the business. My employee that I have in the business is one of my closest friends. She also came to my wedding. It was abroad. We had a great time and we didn't speak about work once. And when I came back, I know that I'd spent kind of like 4.5 years like pushing, like, should we raise money? Should we get this? Should we do this? And I've come back, and I've come back, I guess, with a different perspective in which, and I see it happening from a lot of my friends right now, in that, like, what we've built is brilliant and we can consistently keep going with that business as it is right now, but we don't need to be going, oh, we're going to hire 20 more people by this time next year, because why? We don't need to. Like, it works as it works right now. And yeah, when we, if we have to bring in freelance or someone else when it feels right, let's do it. But I don't want to force it. I don't want to push it. And I'd like to work on other things. Like, there's, I feel like I've got a few good other business ideas in me. Also that can springboard off this platform that I've built, right? Like, a lot of it can be connected. So this is something that just feels so important to me. I love it. I don't ever want to not do it. But at the same time, I'm not so I don't know what I'm not so like blinkered that this is the only way, and this is the only thing that I will do in the future anymore. Which when I was younger, it definitely was.
So talk to me about the financing side of that. So I can't remember if you ended up getting seed investment, but you were definitely, there was a period in time when you were looking for it. So did you end up getting seed investment, and how has the kind of shift of sort of growth that way versus revenue changed in your mind?
Yeah, absolutely. As you mentioned, because of this, I guess, whole pressure to kind of grow and be the next big thing and do all of this, like, I have at times looked to raise investment because I thought it would be the best way that the business could grow, and what would we do with that capital, and we want to be doing XYZ by this time next year. And there's been 2 occasions where I've got very close to accepting investment and pulled out. And on those 2 occasions, I look back now, as absolutely the right decision, because we didn't need it. Like, I think it was that kind of ego thing where it's kind of like, we want to be the next big thing, we want to be this and we want to be that, which was what was driving those things. But then ultimately when I got to it, it never felt right. Yeah, so I think it's definitely, I definitely thought that was probably the only way to be successful, was to raise funding and to have all these employees. But I think I've come to a point now where I'm like, no, it's brilliant the way it is, and it's doing really well, and it will continue to grow, and we don't need to put pressure on things by, raising all this investment. And I'm sure I will work on other businesses in the future where I will take investment and that will feel right. But for this business, and I've learned so much from going through the process of this, like, I feel very proud and blessed that this was, my first business, and the one that will probably see me through as a core business that I have. But has taught me everything I need to know about business in my 20s. I've kind of learned along the way, and this will obviously springboard me into hopefully launching other things alongside it. So yeah.
And just to recognize that is a huge achievement to get to do what you've done in terms of scale and impact and just do it all through organic revenue. So well done for that. When you look back, obviously there are some businesses that do need funding because they've got some tech that they want to develop or whatever. But if people are on the fence of, like, is it right to go for funding or not right at the start of the journey, is there anything you'd share with them or kind of help contextualize that kind of decision making?
I think we can be we can allow our judgment to get clouded at times, because we think that is the only way to succeed, is to raise funding. And I think that it kind of takes a bit of a step back and to go, why am I actually doing this? What is the ultimate goal? What am I trying to achieve out of this? Am I doing this because it will look good on, Business Insider, and like a PR campaign? Or am I doing this because genuinely it's what I want? I want these people to have impact on my business. I feel like the money that we'll have will genuinely go forwards to help us achieve X, Y, Z. And I think you have to kind of really just give yourself like that check, and like, I have a very strong gut feeling when it comes to these things. And, if that kind of changes or doesn't feel right, you should definitely go with your gut. So, I think a lot of people land themselves in sticky situations because they feel they have to go through with it because of, what is deemed as like a successful entrepreneur. But we're a 6-figure business that's doing really well, and ultimately gives me a lifestyle that I absolutely love and adore. So there's just because we're not raising funding, or we've not got investment, or we've not got 25,000 employees, that doesn't mean it's not a success. So yeah.
I love that. And I think that's really important to share, particularly when obviously the bulk of what's out there is around raising funding. And yeah, I think it's really good to sort of counter that view and give the other side. Given that most everything you do is around sort of helping people in their 20s, is there any other like single nugget that you'd love to share with people that are thinking about starting up that are in that age bracket?
Yeah, I think the best thing about starting a business in your 20s is most of the time we don't have as many commitments, and you've also got, fingers crossed, many more years to play with your career. So I feel like you can take bigger risks in your 20s, and that's exactly what I have done and had the privilege to do. I've tried many different things. I've, a lot of things I've done and then failed at, or, I've given this a go. I've tried this. And ultimately, like, I feel like the way that I have grown this business is I have basically like gone to business school with my own business. So I've been able to go through the process of learning how to hire someone for the first time. I've been in lots of conversations about investment, not gone through with it. But if I were to do it in another business in the future, I would have so much knowledge on that right now. I've done how to manage your company finances. I've done, PR, I've done marketing. I've done so many different things, and it feels like I've kind of done a mini MBA with my own business, paid myself to do it at the same time, built something that I'm really proud of that will hopefully then springboard me in the future. So I think if you have that outlook on like the first business that you have is there to teach you all of these things about business, and if it's a vehicle that gets you there and you're not skint because of it, and you actually enjoy the journey, I think it's so valuable to be able to do that, and I'm so grateful that I have been able to do that.
Love that. And just quickly before we wrap up, so obviously we met originally when you pitched in the Manchester final, right at the start of your journey. Just tell us about that experience.
Yeah, that was crazy actually. So we pitched in the Manchester final. We actually pitched that we were going to turn Talk 20s into an app where you could get all these resources. I think that app really exists in terms of YouTube, TikTok. People are just using those platforms more than they are. So essentially we're still creating that content. It's just going on other people's apps, not our own. And we pitched in that, and I think people really, well, the team of judges that you had really liked the idea of how it was, no one was really helping this generation, and that was our goal and our aim to do that. So yeah, just a crazy experience. It's still one of my fondest experiences. It was a really great opportunity to learn how to pitch a business, and I guess I've used those skills continuously throughout the past 2 years since as well. So yeah, it was really cool to win in Manchester for sure.
I really appreciate you maintaining, being a part of the community all this time, and helping us out with our socials and advice and influencing and so on. So yeah, thanks for joining us today, Gaby.
Oh, thanks, Chris. I really appreciate it.